Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to our fourth Tuesday night. Kind of settling into the depths of kind of being in a course at this point. One of my mentors and teachers, Acharya Suzanne Duquette, when she's leading a retreat, as you go deeper in, she will call it, I think it's kind of a amazing metaphor, she'll call it the fat part of the rice. In other words, how a rice kernel, that's not the word, is thin at the tips and fat in the middle. So we're moving a little bit more into the, yes, thank you, Connie, grain. The grain part of the rice. The fat part of the grain, I should say. So we're moving a little bit deeper into the teachings on working with the self. And we're going to talk a little bit more tonight about the cessation of suffering and then get into the path. So we'll start with meditation. I'll just lightly guide us through a mindfulness of body practice, which if you just learned and memorized the name of mindfulness awareness practice in Sanskrit, in other words, if you already knew it, please don't answer this question. But if in the last 3 or 4 weeks you learned the Sanskrit name, could you just write the Sanskrit name in the chat box if you didn't know it before the beginning of this course, but you know it now? Either everybody already knew it or nobody knows it now. It's an S word. Yes, thank you. Thank you. It's shamatha, calm abiding meditation. So we'll do that for about 10 minutes, and then we'll shift into contemplative meditation using the 3-question contemplation that is related to the Four Noble Truths, the experience of suffering and working with suffering. So we'll be practicing for about the next 20 minutes. So please start your engines or stop your engines. And let's get into our online sitting posture, how we feel comfortable and can gather and listen and find the sense of going inward into your own body and mind while at the same time being part of this sangha, this community. So take your seat. Sometimes if you feel really scattered, taking your seat doesn't have to be this detailed alignment or sensory body scan, nor does it have to be this, as we've discussed, sense of groundedness, but dignity and regalness. Sometimes taking your seat, if you're feeling scattered, can just mean reminding yourself what room you're in. Sometimes I will literally remind myself the address of where my body is as I'm meditating, and then the room at that address. And then I'll come into sits bones and long spine. So just remind yourself where you are. And checking in can just be tonight a further scanning just the flavor of your mental experience right now. So speedy mind has a kind of flavor, texture to it. A passionate mind has a kind of texture to it. A sleepy mind has a kind of texture to it. So just see if you can check in by noting the flavor and texture of your own mind right now. And perhaps our practice is getting to the point where we are growing more familiar with the different flavors of our mind. And that can be discomforting because there's a quality of same old me. But it can also be very confidence building because there's a quality of familiarity, which is the whole point of mindfulness awareness practice, that we grow more and more familiar and that our mind takes us by surprise less and less. So when the gong rings, you can begin finding the breath moving in the body easefully, fully, and maybe a little bit more emphasis on the exhalation, that sense of release and softening and opening outward. And working with this attitude of awareness, this basically good witness and holder of our experience that is both warm, non-judgmental, not caught up in whatever arises next in our mind. And if you do get caught up, that's part of the discipline of awareness. Just noting thinking or working without labels, and then choosing to begin again with breath and sensory perception. But discipline here is never punitive. So having settled the mind a little bit around the breath and coming into the room and our sense perceptions, we'll do this form of contemplation. Contemplative meditation is a slightly different way of working with mindfulness and awareness. Same attitude of warm non-attachment, but now there's an actual chance to curiously investigate our thoughts and ideas around these teachings with a given structure. So we let go of the breath and we work with these three questions in this case. And sometimes when we ask a question, we try to narrow in on the answer really quickly. Like, where are my keys? These contemplations are not like that. They're about opening out and just seeing what ideas or what memories or what images or what emotions arise around contemplating a certain teaching, or in this case, asking a question. So don't try to get the answer to the contemplation. Just let the question resonate and see what arises. Let your mind open out with the question rather than narrowing in. So when did I experience dukkha today? Struggle, dissatisfaction, stress, suffering, dukkha. When did I experience dukkha today? Stuck mind. What were the specific causes? What caused this dukkha, this stuck mind? So just let that question ripple and see what comes up. What were the specific causes? How did I work with dukkha skillfully? Again, this question is intentionally posed as a positive. So notice if only negative thoughts about yourself come up in terms of reflecting on this moment or these moments. And see if you can get more curious about any little tool you applied or practice or reminder that allowed you to work with your experience of dukkha just a little bit. How did I work with dukkha skillfully? We can let this contemplation go and just return to the body. So shifting back into a closing minute or two of shamatha. Which is typically how contemplation is often done. That we close by letting go of the directive thinking process and coming back to grounding in the body for a closing period. So we'll just do that for 1 or 2 minutes. So before we get into the lecture, I just wanted to see if anybody wanted to briefly, 1 or 2 or up to 3 people, wanted to share any experiences you had doing that contemplation of those three questions this week. Going once. Bueller. Okay, I see Adriana's. Great, okay. A difficult time distinguishing between a painful moment and suffering. Great, thank you. Yes, that's my experience too, is sometimes those two darts that we talked about, those two arrows come very quickly. Sometimes they seems like simultaneous fire. I think that's also why the interpretation of the First Noble Truth that life is suffering is so popular, why so many people buy it, because it's hard to distinguish between a painful experience and actually this quality of struggle or stuckness or misalignment with experience that causes the pain to be viewed as something more solid than a momentary experience and part of life. Going twice. I used to make this joke that probably some of you have heard before when I had the title of Shastri, which is one of the senior teacher titles in Shambhala, that the word Shastri comes from the word Shastra, which is the complement to a sutra in the Buddhist tradition. So a sutra is a direct dialogue with the Buddha. That's what qualifies as a sutra. And everything else that's an interpretive or secondary teaching, that's somebody else giving some kind of commentary on the teachings, is called a shastra, right? So shastri literally means something like commentator. So I like to translate it as guy who likes to talk a lot. And those of you who know me, I definitely can talk. I could fill up the next 45 minutes very easily with talking about what we'll talk about tonight. The third and fourth noble truth specifically. But because I'm no longer have the title of Shastri, I'd also like to let other people speak. If anybody else wants to share your experience of the contemplation of suffering from this week. So Emily is saying that she was able to see how expectations played a role in causing or were causing some of the suffering she experienced today.
Can I go?
Sure. I see a question. So maybe let's hold questions until a little bit later. I'm just now interested in people sharing your experience of doing this contemplation. So statements from your own wisdom mind of your experience, which your wisdom mind can also state something that was confusing, which is part of gaining wisdom, is knowing what we're confused about. Thank you, Katie, for reframing that. Found that I got negative when I started to see desire patterns. Janet is saying not getting what she wanted. I don't know what that word is, Connie. It was hard for you to see a painful moment from today without it seeming, I don't know what. Use a synonym. Remember, I'm the guy who didn't know what a rice grain was 20 minutes ago. So nitpicking, yeah.
Maybe
okay.
picky.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a quality of reflections that can feel very uh, almost like a fine-tooth comb, and sometimes it feels better just to let things go, but we're also trying to investigate how our mind works. Yeah, so judgment for suffering, like there's a problem or being negative with suffering. Great, great. Was this a useful contemplation, those of you who did it this week? Yeah, I find it's a nice way to get at a little bit of working with suffering just as a simple, rather than going deep into the eightfold path and the 3 different types of suffering and 8 instances of suffering and all of these lists and theories that we can go into. Sometimes it's nice to just have a simple and direct experience in our own contemplation of what we're talking about. So I also realized that the sutra really talks about the sutra where he talks about suffering for the first time, talks about the cause of suffering, which again, his word for the cause of suffering is tanha in Pali, Tanha. There's some other interpretations where the main cause of suffering is ignorance or avidya. His in the Buddha's teaching, he actually talks about 3 types of tanha, 3 types of craving, which really articulate what it's about. But the notion of craving comes up even more poignantly, I would say, in the teachings on karma. And so when we get there next week and the week after, we'll talk about the 3 types of craving, because they're quite interesting, actually. And it decodes it from just like the I want a snack, like I want a cookie. It's not just I want something to mean craving. It's referring to this almost insatiable need for something to be happening. So we'll talk more about that. I want to get into a little bit more cessation, right? And nirodha in Sanskrit, Nirodha, the third noble truth, that this sense of struggle, at least this second dart, this unnecessary harm that we bring on ourselves and that we've learned through our socialization to bring on ourselves again and again, that it can cease. So just really going back to, even though we're talking about suffering and struggle, what a positive message that is. And it's kind of unbelievable, to be honest. I mean, I know I've been studying this stuff for about 25 years, and less than that, the amount of time that I was studying it, not to try to impress somebody, but I've been studying this stuff for 25 years. And I think I know a lot of Buddhist practitioners who, I'll just say it this way, have been studying for much longer than that and don't really believe the third noble truth, right? Or believe it for other people. Like maybe they believe that their teacher or their smarter friend could cease suffering, could cease dukkha. And so this nirodha, this cessation is talking about stepping out of a harmful cycle and the possibility of doing that. Right? And these teachings and related teachings and practices can be used to step out of small harmful cycles. So for example, Dr. Judson Brewer wrote a book called The Craving Mind. He's a Um, he's a psychologist, and he's also a Theravadan Buddhist, all about the research of how to quit smoking and how mindfulness as an intervention is actually much more effective than some other interventions in helping quit smoking. Right? So it could help us cease one pattern of dukkha. But what's really being said here, and it's a challenge to our belief system, it's not like a faith challenge in the universe, it's a faith challenge in ourselves, is that a kind of liberation is possible that's not just symptomatic. I once remember a friend of mine who is a cognitive behavioral therapist, also a Buddhist meditation teacher, was talking about the difference between CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy and Buddhism. And, you know, there's some differences like the role of the therapist, et cetera. Although I think there's some different interpretations where a Buddhist teacher would be like a modern Western psychotherapist, and some interpretations where they're very, very different roles. But one of the distinctions that he made is that cognitive behavioral therapy is what he called symptomatic, which means a person goes because they want to quit smoking or, you know, work with their fear of death, you know, which is a big one, or work with some partial habitual pattern. And he said Buddhism is not symptomatic, or it's addressing all symptoms, right? It's about actually ending. The third noble truth at its deepest interpretation is about ending all cycles of harm within us. So that is, this notion, I just want to say, is a real challenge to our belief system. And it really, I think a lot of us who've been practicing for a long time have to come back to the third noble truth and say, do I really believe that? Or do I believe that I'm just kind of doing this dharma thing to take the edge off my dukkha, you know, to wrap a mala around my dukkha and just sort of have a little buffer, you know, a few mantras or a few phrases of loving kindness that just makes my neurosis, which I'm really never going to step out of fully, more workable. And that's a short selling of these teachings. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to happen tomorrow. We're also working within systems historically that believed in many lifetimes, many iterations of consciousness. But to really let ourselves be confronted in a positive way by the possibility of not just stepping out of certain cycles, like a tendency to make sarcastic comments or smoking or different thoughts of self-aggression that come up in one area of your life, but to say you could step out of all ways of negative habitual patterns. And that's really what the third noble truth is saying. And I love Chogyam Trungpa in his book. He there's this one line, I didn't write it down, so I won't have it verbatim. But there's a place where he talks about sort of our confused energy, our samsaric or cyclically harmful energy, as like a kind of electricity that's running through a system, right? It's not a positive electricity. It's like a shock wave running through a system that we're addicted to. And he talks about how do you unplug from the current without shocking yourself, right? In other words, how do we unplug from dukkha, from causing harm to ourselves, without doing something that's also harmful, because there's so much energy, right? And so the example of the ascetics who were starving themselves to try to overcome their desire, reminds me of that, like these beings who are trying to unplug, but were actually harming themselves in the attempt to unplug from the cycle, right? So that's the other trick here, right, is the cessation of the path to the cessation of suffering can't create more suffering, right? It can't just create new cycles of harm. And that's what the ascetics were engaged in. They were so desperately trying to end the suffering of their desire, but they were harming their bodies, harming an appreciation for their own humanity, harming their own access to their own wisdom in trying to do so. And that's why it didn't work. So again, this notion, as we get into the path, of the question of, is the path sudden or gradual? And the quote from Pema Chodron that I used in the road home from hearing her speak was this brilliant notion that she said, gee, that's funny. I've always thought sudden was the result of a heck of a lot of gradual. And I would really say that the Eightfold Path is meant to be an integrative, gradual path. If you're looking for a sudden path, I would say there are sudden moments or shifts that happen along this path, but what's being prescribed here from beginning till end is a kind of holistic system of slowly unplugging from this sort of harmful current of cyclical, confused energy. Now, some Buddhist teachings say you can do it very quickly, but you have to really know what you're doing to take that approach. And what I like about the Eightfold Path is it lays out a map and says there are many different interpretations of these eight. There's many different activities that you could do that would maybe fit within these eight. And you don't have to accomplish it quickly. So this is the weird dilemma that I've noticed a lot in myself and others in Western Buddhist circles. This is the really weird dilemma around the Third and Four Noble Truths, is that most Western Buddhists do not believe the cessation of suffering is possible for them, for us, for me, like fully, right? But we would like a quick path to get there. The popularity of teachings that sort of talk about sudden shifts in consciousness, the Eckhart Tolles and Adyashantis, which I'm not in any position to judge them, and they've said a lot of useful things, but the sort of notion of somebody saying, tell me how you did this quickly, because I'm not sure I really believe it's possible. You know, it's a very common thing. But let's save ourselves from that sort of self-aggression mixed with idealism of, I don't believe it's possible, but what can you do to make it happen instantly? And let's flip that and say it is possible. And it's probably going to be a gradual, immersive fumbling around through various areas of life. And that's what the Eightfold Path looks at. So I've often made a joke as well, because some Buddhist traditions really emphasize the Eightfold Path. And this joke's a little meaner. So tonight will be the last time I ever make this joke. Some traditions really don't focus on knowing the Eightfold Path. So the joke that I've made, maybe you've heard me make it, is if you want to embarrass a teacher in the Shambhala tradition, ask them what the Eightfold Path is. because we don't, it's not really taught that often, and we don't memorize it like they do in other insight traditions. But the way it's usually framed in Shambhala and many other Tibetan systems is that the Eightfold Path breaks down into 3 groups, which is easier to remember. Right? 3 basic training areas. And in the order that the path goes, these 3 are the training in view, which is what we're doing in these classes primarily. So how we're retraining our conceptual mind. The second area of training is conduct. Our ethical behavior, how we engage in the world, how we express ourselves and listen. So that right there, the fact that you have to train in conduct, that would be part of my argument that even the earliest Buddhist teachings, which focus on self-individual liberation, have a political element to them, because there are certain ethical practices and ethical contemplations and ethical questions that we are meant to reflect on and ask and participate with. And then last, but certainly not least, is the training in meditative disciplines. So study, conduct, and meditation. So these sometimes are called the 3 trainings. So the Eightfold Path breaks down into the 3 trainings. And in Tibetan system, Shambhala, we often speak about the 3 trainings rather than the Eightfold Path. But they're one and the same. So one thing that's really interesting about the Eightfold Path, and this also shares some similarities with the 8 limbs of yoga, for those of you who've studied. It's called the Asangika, 8-limbed. Meditation comes last, right? So this is a really interesting thing about Western practice is, there are all kinds of meditation centers that are called meditation centers, right? That's the thing that's put forward as like, this is the thing that's really going to help you the most. But it's really important to note, at least, that the path of awakening, really what you would call a center is, it would be like a Dharma center would be the study, conduct, and meditation center. A little less sexy, right? But I think part of that, and there's some teachers who argue this compellingly, that the practices of meditation, as difficult as they are in some Western presentations of Buddhism, have been slightly fetishized. And they're actually meant to be practiced when one is studying and one is also contemplating our conduct in the world, which doesn't mean we have to have perfect conduct. That's another thing that I'll say, is that each of the Eightfold Path has the word samyak in Sanskrit in front of it, which there's different interpretations, right? I think Chogyam Trungpa says perfect, which is even more intense than right. And I think maybe a more useful would just be appropriate. Right? So practicing what is appropriate in each of these 8 areas. The way I understand right to not be hyper-judgmental, or perfect to not be hyper-judgmental, has to do with that notion of the truth of dukkha, or suffering, being like some kind of misalignment, right? So right means righting, like realigning our conduct, realigning our way of working with our mind, realigning our intention and our view. So it's interesting because meditation was not meant from a Buddhist standpoint to be practiced separately from studying these teachings and also looking at how we conduct ourselves. So we're going to have a much longer conversation. The word for appropriate was samyak. This is in the document of the overview of the Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path. In Pali, it's Sama, S-A-M-M-A usually. So you received a document with all these lists. So if you want to test your leaky cup a little bit, you can just go back and review. Right. So again, when we're throwing information at you, it's for your use. It's not to make you feel overwhelmed. But the important idea here is that we're trying to realign in these areas. It's like we're really trying to investigate these areas in a holistic way. So two of these, right, relate to, maybe I'll just, for those of us who are online right now, maybe I'll just share the doc. Just in case we want to go over it again and you don't have your show your Dropbox thingy on hand. All right, I'm going to figure out how to share this in a moment. Let's go in instead to the first area, which is training in prajna, or best knowing, right? This is the area of study. So the training of samyak view, right view. And view is sort of an interesting one because view literally has a sense of like, how are you framing your gaze? Right? So there's, and this means sort of like, how have we trained or habituated our conceptual, intellectual mind to receive experience in the present moment? Right? It's so interesting how much the relationship between the map that we are looking at and what we believe about the world are related, right? So one view that a person could have is spiritually, psychologically, personally, is the view of original sin, right? My being is constructed out of that which is flawed in some way, or a mistake that's been passed down through the generations. And so that's interesting, right? What if you have that view of original sin and then somebody compliments you, or somebody flirts with you, or somebody insults you, it's going to be experienced differently than, say, if you had a view of like, I am basically good. At my origin, I am a wisdom being called Buddha, right? I do think having more confidence in our Buddha nature makes it easier to read your Amazon reviews. It's not always that easy. The worst is when it's so clear that the person did not read what you wrote. Right? But that view of like, I am basically good might shift the way that I receive the information. So training in view is so important because it starts to restructure the lens of our conceptual framework, right? I mean, we know this from our world. We know, and I've had friends talk about tragically, elderly parents who just sit in front of the television watching cable news. And it could be any cable news station, but in this case, it was Fox News. And that's a training in view, right? Watching the feeds that feed us, they give us certain worldviews. So the story was of and I've heard multiple stories like this, just an elderly person sitting in front of a television, just watching cable news and just growing angrier and angrier, right? The experience of life coming out of holding that worldview just made them angrier and angrier, right? And so the part of this is the realization in all of these teachings that we are holding on to views that may not actually be properly aligned with reality. So one of the views that we will study towards the end of this course is the view of a truly existing self-identity. And part of our study is how do I really usefully and slowly replace that with a view of what the self actually is, how it actually functions. The other one that's in this category of what our studies are about, so it's about retraining view, and it's also about retraining our intention. It also gets translated sankalpa as right understanding. But I like intention, right? This sense of, here we go. Figured it out. So sankalpa, practicing intention. Like, what are we trying to do? It says when we get into the teachings on karma that intention is really important, right? So if you are trying to cause harm, that's really going to affect the way we practice everything else, right? If you're trying to be helpful, but you do something stupid, that's very different than trying to cause harm, right? And that's one of the things happening in different circles now with the different movements of listening and understanding and listening to marginalized groups of people. And I love this as a framework because I think it's incredibly Buddhist, is, and you may be familiar with this, acknowledging the difference between intention and impact, right? And this is very Buddhist because a lot of times when somebody says you caused harm, you engaged in wrong action, what we want to say is, but I didn't mean to, and my intention was over here, right? And so knowing what our intention is a very deep Buddhist practice. And there's so many ways that, and we're going to do contemplation of intention at the end of this evening tonight. And if our actions deviate from our intention, that's very workable. That's easier to realign than if we don't even know what our intention is, which, let's face it, that's how life normally is. Like I don't really know what I was trying to do there. I was flying on autopilot a little bit. And it's much better to have a positive intention, but sometimes screw up, than it is to be trying to hurt oneself or others. So a cultivation and contemplation of intention, and we're going to talk about at the end of tonight the intention to renounce suffering, renounce samsara. So right view and right intention are what all of this study that we're doing is trying to slowly shift and establish. And we work with it through the aspects of prajna that we talked about in our first week, hearing, contemplating, and meditating. We work through it with arguing with people. We work through it with asking questions. We work through it with letting our intention and view evolve as our practice evolves. So again, these are the pieces of a gradual awakening. So study, right view, right intention. And then the second segment of the Eightfold Path is the path of conduct. How do we conduct ourselves in the world? So number 3 is appropriate or right action. Action is actually related to the word karma, so that word, a form of that word, is used here. And this is a deep body of teachings because there's many different ethical practice lists. The 2 most dominant ones in early Buddhism are the 5 precepts and the 10 right actions. So we're going to get into hopefully making those useful when we talk about ethical conduct more in depth towards the end of this course. Number 4 is right speech, which I always marvel because I think when the Buddha first gave these teachings, he literally meant speech. Like there was not even any of this, even though you're hearing a representation of my voice right now. And he literally meant meeting a fellow traveler on the path of life on the road and how we used our words, vocalized. They didn't even have written words then, right? So now when we talk about right speech, we're talking about bringing Twitter to the path, right? Bringing text messaging to the path. Bringing listening is the flip side of right speech. When Thich Nhat Hanh teaches about right speech, most of his teachings are about listening, right? The interchange of dialogue, how that can be a tool for compassionate awakening. So there's a whole bunch of teachings on right speech. And then the 5th one and the last one in the path of Shila or conduct is right livelihood. Huge question for modern practitioners. Sometimes the old lists don't make a ton of sense in some ways. They seem either mystical or ancient or maybe not understanding impermanence. So at the time of the Buddha, one of the wrong livelihoods was supposedly fortune teller. So I hope nobody here is into tarot or astrology or anything like that. A maker of weapons was considered a wrong livelihood. We could debate that. In Tibetan thought, being a butcher, directly killing an animal, was considered wrong livelihood, although people ate meat. So I personally have a problem with that. You know, if you're going to eat meat, you can't really call killing animals wrong livelihood. those of us who do eat meat should actually thank the butcher, right? Um, so that's a huge body of teachings, right? And for most of us, our livelihood is what we spend with the most waking hours. So if you're not a monk or you're not a yogi, and if you're not tuning in from a cave somewhere, um, livelihood is so important. All the questions that come up about how our livelihood is brought to the path of awakening. And then we get to the three parts of the Eightfold Path that have to do with meditation, right? So appropriate or right effort, yayama. There's great teachings on 4 types of right effort. Thich Nhat Hanh and others give that are really helpful about how to work with. It really has to do with how to work with cultivating virtuous and non-virtuous states of mind. So a lot of different meditative practices that we'll work with as we go forward might actually fall into the category of right effort. I've been contemplating whether, for example, loving kindness meditation and Tonglen meditation could fit under right effort because it's about shifting positive modes of thinking. Right mindfulness, which usually has to do with the 4 foundations or 4 aspects of mindfulness, which there's a whole body of teachings on. Mindfulness here means how are we framing our mind? What are we choosing to place our attention upon, to take as an object when we meditate? And then finally, and this is interesting, the ability to develop concentration, samadhi, is considered the 8th of the Eightfold Path. So this is a tricky one because in terms of our ability to concentration, the most simple technical definition is our ability to stay with and come back to the given object that we are trying to place attention on. So the breath or the presence of the person we're trying to generate compassion for. And some Buddhist teachers will say, don't worry about concentration. It's okay if your mind is all over the place, which I'm one of those. Because honestly, what are you going to do if it's all over the place, right? That's just part of life. That's part of practice. But learning how to develop deeper states of concentration is part of the Eightfold Path. On the other extreme of maybe spending too little attention to concentration, I often hear people in a very, I don't want to gender it too much, but in a very masculine way in certain meditative circles, talking about attaining certain states of concentration, which are called the jhana states, as sort of this goal in and of themselves. And the Buddha was very explicit that attaining a state of meditative concentration without the right view does nothing for you. In fact, it could, or the right intention, it could just lead you to kind of a frozen state of consciousness for a long period of time. So concentration is part of the path, but there's a lot of different interpretations of how directly important it is. So that's the Eightfold Path. If you can't remember 8, just remember those 3. Those 3 being study, conduct, and practice. And they're meant to be interdependent with each other. This would be my criticism, and a lot of people share this criticism of the mindfulness movement, which the mindfulness movement is doing great things, but part of the idea of the mindfulness movement basically reads as Buddhism has a few really this is the way it reads. Buddhism has a few really helpful pieces to it, but it's also viewed as a spirituality and a religion. So if we want to bring what's good about Buddhism further into secular Western society, we should focus on mindfulness as a body of secular tools that people of any spiritual or religious background can utilize. Now that makes complete sense, and I totally get it. The only problem with that is it's very clear that the Buddha meant for all of these areas, the Eightfold Path, the 3 areas of training, to be worked with in an integrated and interdependent educational way. So it's very clear that what he thought he was presenting was not a religion, but a complete holistic life path for awakening, right? So it's an interesting dilemma, right? When we have to present meditation or mindfulness, when really what is being said is the path to awakening is about taking this integrative, holistic educational approach, right? And sometimes we're having problems with our meditation practice because we're not really clear about our intention, you know? And so it's better to go back and reflect on intention than to practice meditation. Sometimes we're not clear on view. Sometimes our conduct is muddled in my own personal experience. And that actually affects the way we meditate, you know? So fetishizing and separating mindfulness meditation from the path definitely is good as an entry point to separate it out, but it chops up a holistic educational model in a way that might not actually be healthy and might lead to more problems later on. So that's my little pro and con spiel about the mindfulness movement. So I feel like I've said enough. I'll say a little bit before we do our closing contemplation, but I'd love to open it back up to questions, comments, diatribes, remembering this notion of stepping up and stepping back that we introduced last week. So please, the floor is yours. Either grab your microphone or chat away.
Hi. I guess my question, or I guess confusion, is regarding, I feel like a lot of the readings that we've had is that, and you said it yourself, Ethan, that concentration isn't necessarily liberation, like meditative absorption. So I'm just curious why the Eightfold Path like stops there. Like it's concentration as number 8. And then what?
Right. I don't think so. Thank you for that question. I think there's a difference. There's a lot of overlay. Those of you who've studied yoga in depth, there's a lot of overlay between the 8 limbs of yoga and the Buddhist Eightfold Path. When I've studied like Iyengar's reading on the 8 limbs of yoga, the 8 limbs do seem more sequential. I don't think the Eightfold Path is meant to be sequential, although you're right. The way the Buddha described his awakening was joining increasing stages of concentration, meaning increasing stages of the ability to hold his mind to a view and intention that was compassionate and awakened. So what he said, and what others, especially in the insight lineage, have said, is that if you practice concentration without right view and intention and without contemplating your conduct and so forth, you enter these jhana and samadhi states, these deeper states of concentration that can feel very blissful, but that leave you back in, that wear off eventually, because you basically lose awareness of non-self and lose awareness of impermanence, and you're left back in some kind of samsaric cycle. So it's the joining of the Eightfold Path. Although the night before his awakening, he did enter deeper states of concentration. However, he supposedly had entered all those states of concentration before in his first meditation career with his first meditation teacher, who basically taught concentration meditation, these deeper states of meditative absorption. That teacher's name, I believe, was Udaka something, or Alara Kalama. There were two teachers, and the Buddha actually surpassed the teacher's ability, Siddhartha, surpassed the teacher's ability to concentrate. And the teacher was actually pretty humble about it. He said, please stay and teach us, rather than get the hell out of here, you're making me look bad, you know. But the Buddha said, these states of concentration, you know, I entered them, and they don't alone lead to what I'm looking for, which is the cessation of suffering. So it's this interesting thing, because I do think there is a real danger when you start talking, you know, even some Tibetan teachers talk about different stages of the settled mind in shamatha, like Sakyong Mipham Rinpoche and turning the mind into an ally, and others, about your ability to stay with 21 cycles of breath, and then 108 cycles of breath, and then always staying with the breath. And these are describing increasing experiences of concentration. And that could just make us turn our meditation practice into kind of a video game. And so I think when teachers are saying this isn't important, they're reminding us, like, look at all of these other things we're trying to practice. But it's true that chronologically, the last thing the Buddha did was enter deeper states of concentration. However, he entered them with a correct view and a compassionate intention, whereas earlier on in his meditation career, he just entered them without them being related to the others. So I think it's dangerous to look at these as too linear, like increasing importance. I think they're meant to be an interdependent map of 8 interlocking practices and areas of exploration. Yes.
בכל העולם גולשים על שלג, אולם בישראל גולשים על חול. לגבעות החול האלה קוראים דיונות, הן גבוהות מספיק שאפשר להתגלגל.
That was so cool. So I want to answer Joy's question, because this is really interesting. I can't remember. So Joy's question is the Eightfold Path the only means to cessation of suffering? My understanding is what the Buddha said was basically yes. Now, that doesn't mean that a person has to be a Buddhist, or it has to necessarily be framed that way. But he claimed that any path to liberation would have a structure like this, right? So I also encourage you to look that, like, within this structure, there's so many different ways of relating to these different explorations, right? Right mindfulness could mean your yoga practice, right? Right livelihood could mean being an artist or a psychotherapist, right? Right effort could mean so many different things. So I don't think he's describing, I don't think the Buddha ever meant to teach a Buddhist path. He was really just trying to describe the structure of an educational paradigm that leads to full awakening and full liberation from suffering. And I think there's lots of different cultural and personal mappings that could suit this sort of structure. Right? It's like there's lots of ways to build a house, right? But there's certain rules of gravity and maybe certain rules of structuring that all houses have to have. And so that's the way I take the Eightfold Path, is he's laying out the structure of any spiritual path that would lead to awakening. Right? So meditation could also mean prayer, I think. Concentration could also mean prayer. Right? As long as it's with a right view, which means that the view isn't that you are believing in a solid, permanent self, right? So praying to God without belief in a solid, permanent self could completely be a means to the end of suffering if it's done with the right view and the right intention. All kinds of things can fit this mapping, I think. Does that make sense? I don't want to be too liberal about it, but I do really think his purpose here was to describe a path of liberation, not say this is what my tradition is. He's trying to describe structures of the way the mind and reality work. He's not telling you where to put the incense or if you need incense. That comes later. And then people get really, really stuck there, right? The incense goes here. And they're like, I don't know if that's Dharma. Getting really, really stuck about where the incense goes. The texts say this, we have to follow the texts. The texts were written by a person having an awakened experience at a certain moment in time, you know? So it's interesting to study Buddhism, and this is something we'll get into pretty deeply in our third course, how to study something and see it as a really useful structure without fixating on the structure of the teachings. Yes, and that's, Adriana saying, etiquette police, and that's the problem with every spiritual tradition throughout history, is it took ideas about how to be a decent and compassionate human and then solidified them into you have to do it this way, you can't do it that way, right? To the point where you literally have in various parts of this world people who are basically third cousins with each other, ready to kill each other, you know? And Buddhists are not immune to this, you know? There's like watching the Vice documentary on the persecution and slaughter of the Rohingya, that really affected me. Seeing a Buddhist monk with like the angriest face of fascism, right? None of this is about being a Buddhist. Only become a Buddhist or keep being a Buddhist if it helps you liberate yourself and others from suffering. That's what he's saying. That's Sharon Salzberg always says this, is the Buddhist says, I teach two things, suffering and the liberation from suffering. If where you place the incense is helpful to the end of suffering, then let's pay close attention to that. If where you place the incense causes further suffering, that's not the path of awakening. So here's an interesting question. How do the defects of the pot fit in with the three trainings? I think of the defects of the pot primarily related with the first of the three trainings, how we are cultivating our study. That's just the way I think of it the most directly. But I think you could interpret it differently as well. But my thought is that they most directly apply to the view and intention. when we're trying to begin to frame, right? Because what view and intention are is the framing of our experience, right? If you watch a news channel that tells you the self is not solid, be compassionate to self and others, and you watch that for 5 hours, you're going to come out of that with a different view, a different experience than if you watch a television station for 5 hours that says people who don't look like you are trying to rape your sister, which is Fox News. I wish I was exaggerating on that. Wouldn't that be nice if I was like being a liberal Buddhist teacher exaggerating right now? That's literally what Fox News says, right? So what we're saying is spend 5 hours every day saying the self is not as solid as I thought, and I can be compassionate and warm to myself and compassionate and warm to others. And then what happens if I go out into the world having watched that station for 5 hours? Yeah, and Ted is mentioning this passage where Chogyam Trungpa talks about, he really emphasized this sort of, when he taught this individual path, which I just want to go back to saying, I think that can be very helpful. He talks so much about aloneness, you know, and this willingness to be alone with ourselves as part of the way that we deal with suffering. And, you know, I think so often we struggle with meditation because it's really hard to experience your own aloneness with yourself, you know? I spend most of the nights of my life sleeping in a bed with 2 other human beings, and I still feel alone. Nothing weird happens. I still feel alone. Does anybody else have that experience where maybe you're like, you're with your partner, maybe you have multiple children or relatives, you have a dog or a cat, and you're just all lying in a heap and you're like, I am completely alone here. And so the path of awakening is about experiencing that. And then also experiencing our connection out of it. But that's the other interesting piece of this, is that it's a shared experience, but we're completely alone. Now, the interpretations I don't like is where aloneness goes a little too far in the libertarian direction. It starts to sort of de-acknowledge or dismiss our location in an interdependent network. It can start to make us feel like this sort of like, everything that I do right on the path is my doing, everything I do wrong is my doing. It can make us feel very distant from compassion for other people, because it's like, I can't help them. And that interpretation of aloneness or individual path, I don't buy at all. But this notion of really taking a moment, especially when we're working with something like the Four Noble Truths, to just see how unique your experience is, and how there's really no way to share it with anybody else on a certain level. And that's what I find so beautiful about this path, is you're not going to have the same path that anybody who's ever been on this path has had. And still, there are universal statements that can be made that apply to all human beings and all sentient beings, like the Four Noble Truths. Each person's path is so unique and yet so similarly structured in these ways. That's the beauty of these teachings to me. So Lucy is asking, what are we structuring our lens to do, right? And again, this realignment notion, the structuring of the lens and view is to see things more clearly, right? So, for example, to see how karma works, how cause and effect work within one mind cycle, which we'll talk about the next 2 weeks. To see that the self is not solid, and we often, almost always misperceive the self. And so it's not, we're not trying to put on a rosier colored lens. It's not like we're taking the self-hatred and hatred of others, the suffering lens, and trying to put on this other, just watch this other channel. It's that we are actually trying to remove any filters between us and reality. But the notion is, to do that from a view standpoint, you do have to start with a conceptual lens, right? There's no way to get to non-conceptual direct experience without clarifying our conceptual reality, which is why we study, you know. Otherwise, we would just sit the whole time. 2 hours of meditation. How many people would sign up for that class? 2 hours of meditation once a week. So it'd be a little bit harder, but also, and this is something I've heard several different Tibetan teachers say, if you meditate without contemplating your view, it's not like you don't have a view. It's that your meditation practice actually just deepens you into the view you already have. So if you have the view that the self is solid and basically bad, even when you go to do something like shamatha meditation just settles you deeper into that view, right? So that's another way of looking at meditation that has to do with hearing, contemplating, and meditating. That cycle is that, and I said this in our first week, meditation deepens us with the views that we've already been integrating, the conceptual view. It makes those conceptual views more where our experience is coming from. It integrates concept with experience. And therefore, if your concept is poisoned, your meditation is just going to sink you into that poison. Like watching 5 hours of Fox News a day. That's just that's a meditation, right? It's a meditation on a particular view. Or watching 5 hours of MSNBC a day. I don't particularly think you're getting a particular worldview there, right? Particularly dramatized worldview. Might be a worldview that has some policy issues that seem to be more in accord with reality, but it's also really sinking into someone else's worldview, right? So now we're sinking into an awakened being's worldview, supposedly, and seeing if, how that feels. Let's see if I missed a question. Any other questions about Eightfold Path clarifications? You are allowed to do tarot readings and be on the path. I'm not exactly sure why that. I've contemplated that one a lot, why fortune teller was considered wrong view. And maybe it's because it has too much to do with wanting to control the future rather than actually setting an intention and practicing and then seeing what happens. I'm not sure. So this is a great question. Gala's asking, if you're a beginner and you're just learning shamatha, for example, because Gala teaches shamatha to a lot of beginners, how do you speak to the idea of contemplating your view? And have you all heard the one about the old fish and the young fish? The old fish who's the wise master, swims up to two very young fish in the ocean and goes, "How's the water today, guys?" And they turn to each other and go, "What's water?" Right? They are so in their experience that they don't see the context, of their experience. And view is like that. So I think it's hard to introduce view. I think it's hard to introduce view to somebody who's just trying to release stress a little bit. And maybe some of you are feeling overwhelmed by all of the view conversations we're having in this course. And I think some of it is just how we show up. Like, we don't have to like go up to our friends and say, want to meditate, but you know, it's going to completely change your view of original sin. The sort of like, do you want to follow your breath and reduce your stress might be a better approach, right? So there's a view in that, the view of stress reduction. So the way I would say it is that working with our beginner's mind, work with view on the more relative level. Like, what am I trying to do on a more relative level, right? So here's one view that Sharon Salzberg loves to restate: always begin again, right? So just take that view. It doesn't have to be about non-self and karma and cessation of suffering. It could just be like, if I can just practice starting again when my mind wanders, think of what an awesome skill that would be to build. That's a view and an intention right there. So I think you can always deliver view. But the other thing I think is the view of basic goodness and Buddha nature. That's like the old fish walking up to the young fish and saying, "How's the water?" Like, it's so encompassing and also so contradictory to the way we usually move about the world, right? We move about the world usually like, I am a problem and everybody else is a problem too. And you can't always, like, same way. It's not like you can just give your friend who used to watch Fox News, you can't just give them like The Atlantic and say, just read this, because they're not going to believe what they read, right? Believe me, I've tried. The view has to develop slowly, right? Interesting. Judy, are you saying that looking to an external source for guidance is a wrong view? I'm not sure.
I was actually responding to the tarot card thing.
Great. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I do find, I am a fan of things like astrology and so forth. And the Tibetan Dun season is an astrological thing. And I do find there's a fine line between showing up, being present, seeing what happens, and then wanting to have control over the future.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh. Also, the Tibetan ritual of the weather, the weather, I can't think of the name right now, but the people who predict and move the weather, that's always, I read in one of Stephen Batchelor's books about, the elders who, there are some who are appointed to predict and communicate with the weather. And I thought, I was wondering about that, because that, some would say that that's much like fortune telling in that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is related to Hilder's question about the Buddhist take on instinct and intuition. I think we can have all kinds of views on that. I often wonder about instinct and intuition, if part of it is that actually our system, our sensory system, our emotional intelligence system is actually a lot more precise than we thought it was. And so when we are more present, you actually naturally pick up on more things. So it feels like, oh, they seem sad, you know, I think that person is sad right now. And from a sort of more intuitive standpoint, that's, you know, intuitive healers might say that you're picking up on something. I think you could make a Buddhist argument that what's really going on there is you're just more attuned to your sense perceptions, which are naturally designed to read emotions if you're paying close attention to the present moment. So I don't know, you could make a like non-mystical argument that an increase in intuition with an increase in mindfulness just comes from paying more attention, and we're actually picking up on stuff all the time, which is also why subliminal advertising works so well, because we're picking up on stuff and we don't know that we're picking up on it. But I want to leave space for also the idea that maybe the five senses and our sense of thought are not our only doorway into the universe, you know. Chogyam Trungpa used to say with questions like this, and it's one of my, I'm so happy that a Buddhist teacher would say it. It's also Inigo Montoya in The Princess Bride also says this in one scene: your guess is as good as mine. So if you believe that tuning in a little bit gives you more read on the universe, and that has a slightly more magical component, I have no way of disproving you. I do know that you will probably gain more emotional intelligence if you combine, here's what I'll say, if you combine the practices of view and intention, the practice of mindfulness, and the practice of right speech, the listening component. That there's just a sense of reading situations more. And it might just be more attuned sense perceptions. I don't know. It might be as scientific as that or as mundane as that. Who knows? Okay, maybe one more question if anyone has one, and then we'll do our contemplation on renunciation. Okay, so Matthew is referencing, and we're actually going to use parts of the book that you're referencing in our fourth course, The Gradual Path by Miles Neal. So speaking to the role of ritual. And what I'll say for now in terms of ritual, and we'll get back to it, because when we start talking about Tantric Buddhism or Vajrayana, which is what the fourth and the fifth, yes, gradual awakening. The fourth and the fifth course are all about the sort of aspects of the practice that are more ceremonial become very important. What I'll say about ritual now is whatever rituals are useful to you, if it's a bow, if it's doing the 7-day meditation commitment that we'll do at the end of class tonight, whatever they do for you, what they're really meant to do is just create a supportive environment, and they're what we sometimes call container, right? That it's not just about this sort of personal discipline. It's actually setting up an environment where your mind feels enriched and you want to practice. So it could be as simple as like having a nice gong that you like to ring at the beginning and end of your meditation session. It could be as simple as lighting a candle. Since I've made fun of incense in some Buddhist traditions is, it's said that there's beings who live in a different realm who actually are nourished by scent. So I always have thought of offering incense to a shrine as kind of an offering of like thinking of all the beings that I am not aware of that may exist in other realms, you know, and that those other realms could just be like Syria, you know, or in my case, Staten Island, and just honoring that there's other realms that exist, right, that you're not aware of. Meredith is from Staten Island, so that was for her. And yeah, it's the notion of container, or what Elijah Goldstein calls enriched environment. Yeah, similar to a positive holding environment. So it could just be a candle that you light or a little statue. Those things are all very helpful. And if you're finding a struggle practicing, it might be taking up the ritual aspect a little bit. And to that point, the microsangha aspect of the quads is meant to be sort of a supportive container for just having buddies along the path. So I'm going to ask one more time. We might restructure them after the end of the first course, but if you've been giving the quads like effort, if you could just take that up to okay effort, just take it up a little bit. I know some of the quads are going really well. You guys are like invited to each other's Thanksgivings at this point. And that's always the way it is, that some people take to their quads, and some people are a little less engaged. So there's nothing to do about that. And if the quads aren't for you, that's okay too. We're not trying to force anything, but I just want to see what happens if we really invest in that a little bit more, and see if there can be some benefit drawn from that. That being said, I want to lead us into our closing contemplation, because it's about that time. So come into your meditative seat. Remind yourself where you are. And we'll just reflect on the cessation of suffering. So sometimes commitment to the cessation of suffering is called renunciation. A more literal translation of renunciation is definite emergence from the cycles of suffering. And I just want us to challenge ourselves with this question: is the cessation of suffering possible for me? I'm not talking about now. But just notice what your feelings are towards that. Is the cessation of suffering possible for me? And then let's see if we can flip it. The cessation of suffering is possible. See if you can place your thoughts on that phrase. The cessation of suffering is possible. You can start to let this contemplation go. Come back into the room that you're in. Find a few closing breaths. So for those of us who would like to make a commitment with your friends in this online Sangha to daily meditation practice, and this commitment is, again, just the idea of setting an intention. So this would fall under the category of appropriate intention, samyak sankalpa. This daily practice could be 5 minutes, it could be half hour, it could be however long you'd like it to be, but the idea is that we're committing to daily practice. And if you miss a day, part of the commitment is how you work with kindness towards yourself when you don't quite live up to your intention, which is a huge part of this path. So if you would like to recite this vow with me, we can do that. I, Ethan, with confidence in the benefits of a regular practice of sitting meditation, do hereby commit for myself and no one else to practicing at least one session of sitting meditation for as short or as long a period of time as I am willing and able for each of the next 7 days. And just to review, I'll just read the bottom part, just to review what the effects of setting an intention like this are. The taking of this vow creates a tangible memory in the mind of the person speaking it. The mind of the vow taker is tethered to the flagpole of their commitment, bound only by an elastic cord of awareness. Whenever we stray from our vow, may that cord of awareness snap us back with gentleness and humor into the space of our practice. Okay. All right. Well, there we go. Okay, everyone. I hope you have a really lovely week. We have class again on Saturday for those of you who are joining the weekend class. And then we're going to go deep into understanding karma for 2 weeks, which is good because it's not an easy thing to understand. And it's not just about tipping your barista at your local cafe. It's about more than that. So I hope you all have a really wonderful week, and hope it's warm wherever you are, and we'll be in touch.